Good morning. It's good to be back among you. When I arrived this morning, Sylvia gave me this lovely flower. And in the first hymn that we sang, if you recall, there's a line that says, "We give garlands rather than ashes." You see, some worship communities this past week put ashes on people's heads. You give flowers. I think that's a nicer custom. And it's a reminder of spring, obviously, these beautiful flowers. So it's nice to be here. Individual and community. I gave you two articles which are attached to your order of service, two recent articles. The second one has to do with the radical conceptions of individual, which we hear all the time in our society, and that it can be very damaging when we focus only on the individual. People and groups focusing only on themselves to the detriment of the common good of the whole community. And this has stimulated my thinking, that article from the Chicago Tribune, about what is a healthy relationship? Because we all want to value individuality. Each of those crayons has a unique individuality. We don't want to destroy it. But they all were together in that common little glass. How do we have a healthy relationship then between individual and community today? Now, Aristotle, the great philosopher, really believed that we are social animals and that all individuals are fulfilled as individuals in their social relationships with others in a community. For him, the polis, the city-state, the political society, was the highest form of individual expression. It was human beings deliberating with one another how to construct a community of common concern. Politics, then, for him, was the most noble of all professions. Citizens pursuing the good life together. How far we have come from that ideal. Our founding fathers also believed in community. They put checks and balances in government to prevent it from overstepping its boundaries and smothering the individual. But they always assumed that there would be healthy local communities between the individual and the government to help the individual flourish and to keep society healthy. Private citizens groups, town hall meetings, local church assemblies. They really thought these communities would nourish a sense of respect for the individual, but also a sense of responsibility to the common good. They helped defend human rights, but they were also places where citizens carried out their duties to one another. From these communities were the places where both individual rights and responsibilities could develop together, and that would benefit not only the individual, but the whole society. Now, the world's religions, all of them, speak of the transcendent sacred value of every individual. The three religions of the book, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, teach that the image of God is in every human being. Hinduism believes that Brahman, or God, is in every human being. The Buddhists are convinced that we are all interconnected and that all sentient beings are sacred. Now, these traditions also emphasize the importance of communities if a sense of the sacred in the individual is to be preserved and enhanced. So in Judaism, it's the synagogue, the little assembly, and the home. In Christianity, in early Christianity, it wasn't an institution. They were local assemblies of groups of people who met in homes. In Islam, it's the mosque. In Buddhism, the Sangha. And in Hinduism, the ashram. Religious consciousness, faith, and ethical life all need nourishment in the world religions by participation in communities that furthered collective enlightenment, support, and sharing. Now, that article in the Chicago Tribune. Before we get to that, the three readings in your book this morning that we all read give us clues to what a healthy community should look like. Brothers and sisters surround us, says the first reading. Our relationships go beyond blood. Everyone is our brother and sister. We enlarge our individuality because when we come together, our voices are in common in singing and in speaking. And it says the warmth of each other's hands assures us. In the Litany of Restoration, it says we join our spirits. And the pain of our aloneness is lessened when we are together. And differences do not matter because we have common goals, common values. whether it be age, gender, sexual preference, class, or political choice. All the crayons can be different, but we have a common purpose. And then that last reading, the spirit of community, says we find strength and common purpose when we come together. And we bring into our circle of concern all who need our love and support, not just members of our own community. And you witnessed that this morning in the Joys and Concerns. There were people mentioned who we don't know, but who are part of our concern. That's a sign of a healthy community. Because we are one with all of humanity, as that reading said. What these readings are teaching us is that healthy community, a real community, strengthens and supports each individual. It's all inclusive. Judgments are not made based on differences. And the community nourishes a sense of concern for those beyond itself, believing that all of us are interconnected with all human beings. Over the past month, I've been in different worship communities. I'm like a circuit rider, and I enjoy worshiping, in different communities. One thing that saddens me is that when it comes time for the joys and concerns, so many communities are us, us, us. This morning, your concerns reached beyond yourself. I was very impressed. Because many worship communities are places where people come together away from the world. We want to get away from it all. We want to help each other. And the circle gets closed. That's not a healthy community. And you haven't fallen into that trap, and I praise you for it. Now, that article by Daniel Byrne, The Cost of Radical Individualism. He gives many examples today of what he considers to be an over-exaggeration of focus on the individual without any sense of responsibility to the wider community. He calls it the commonweal. He sees this danger happening across the political spectrum and manifested in such things as hyper-emphasis on freedom from gun legislation, or the celebration of the legalization of marijuana without any concern as to what the longer-term effects may be on the community, especially for the young. He even quotes Pat Buchanan, not known for his radical ideas, as saying the idea of autonomous individual is chipping away at our sense of community in our society today. Now, we might not agree when you read that article with all the examples he gives. I don't. But I think he's onto something, that there's something going on in our society, and we see it in the media a lot, a stress on individual autonomy, that a healthy sense of community and responsibility to the commonweal is not stressed enough. My take on this, this is where the article got me thinking, and he doesn't mention this, but here's what I think is happening. I think we're experiencing an alienation from other people today in our society in many different ways. In politics, in the media, even in religious communities. There's a divisiveness that's being cultivated that's destroying the common fabric of society that we need to hold together. It's a divisiveness based on manipulation of the individual by creating a false or fictional sense of community that is neither healthy nor is it real. For example, the idea that government is our enemy, not part of our community that serves us. The idea that there are law-abiding citizens, and then those illegals that are creeping across our borders. The idea that the straight people are the good ones, and those gay people are ruining morality. The idea that hardworking Americans, and then those loafers who want to live off the dole and don't want to work. The idea that there are good Christians, and then those sinners who control our institutions. You see, what we're being told is that there are these good communities and bad communities. And it's creating divisiveness, and it's false because those dichotomies really are not real. Who's doing it? Those with power and wealth are creating a fictional sense that there are the good and the bad in our country today. Their purpose is to divide and manipulate individuals who actually share much with others who are different from themselves. The farmers in Wisconsin couldn't survive without undocumented aliens doing the work. They need them. We need them. But they're the enemy. So people who can manipulate this create in us a fear of the other as enemies, rather than helping us to reach out and acknowledging, as Steve said, we do have things in common with these people. We share a common humanity, at least on some things. And we should be welcoming people into our circle of concern. And then turning our concern and opposition to the real destroyers of community in our land. The economic and political spin doctors who show little responsibility to the common good other than to pursue their own self-interests at the expense of everyone else. They divert criticism from themselves by pitting us against one another. That's tribalism, that's not community. Where do we go from here? Well, what we need to counter this fictional sense of community is to create and maintain at the local level where we can healthy communities where we can honestly speak to these falsehoods and name them for what they are, and welcome those different from ourselves into our circles of concern, and reach out to those suffering in our society rather than condemning them as evil. Your Unitarian community is a very good example of such a community, and you should be grateful for what you have. Believe me. But don't become smug. It's so easy to judge those other worship communities who have their head in the sand. I know. They're not there yet. Rather than condemn them, and then we create our own false sense of community or divergence, think of them as a work in progress. A work in progress, you know? Maybe they'll get there someday. Maybe they will include in their worship services the kind of concerns you have in yours. Continue to be healthy yourself. And where you can, reach out to some people in those other communities and try to kind of incorporate them in your concerns, your movements, the movement to amend, you know, the Constitution on Citizens United. Reach out to other communities on that and other ways. They're real people. Share with them. It's so easy when we have something good to say, oh man, we got it, those people over there, oh boy, they are suffering too, and we're all part of the community. Try to help one another. Now, the second article I gave you this morning, to me, was shocking when I read it. Absolutely shocking, from its source. This appeared in the Green Bay Catholic Diocesan newspaper last Sunday. An unsigned editorial from the Catholic newspaper in South Africa condemning discrimination against gays. Now, you may be aware that there are many African countries now passing legislation criminalizing gay and lesbian behavior and putting these people in jail. When Uganda passed its law criminalizing gays and lesbians, the next day the newspaper published 150 famous gays and lesbians with their pictures so that people could go after them. Now, this article is very interesting. The Catholic Church is not known for its defense of gays and lesbians. A recent poll in the United States of gays and lesbians, 70% said that the Catholic Church is one of its biggest opponents. Ironically, the average Catholic, 60% of Catholics today in the United States support gay marriage. But the official voice of the bishops does not. And that causes pain for people in that community. Now, the interesting thing about this article, it's Catholic. It's grounded in biblical values. It even quotes the Catechism of the Catholic Church. And it says, don't discriminate against gays. We cannot be who we are if we condemn these people in a false community. They are part of us. Let's read it together. Africa's anti-gay laws. Where there is injustice, we must expect the Catholic Church to stand with the powerless. Therefore, the Church should sound the alarm at the advance throughout Africa of draconian legislation aimed at criminalizing homosexuals. It would require a very peculiar reading of the gospel to locate Jesus anywhere else but at the side of the marginalized and vulnerable. Recently, the Ugandan and Nigerian parliaments both passed severe anti-gay legislation. Uganda's president, Yoweri Museveni, has vetoed it. Now, since this article appeared on January 29th, President Museveni signed the law. He signed it. Nigeria's president, born-again Christian, Goodluck Jonathan, signed it into law. Other countries, such as the Cameroon and Tanzania, are proposing to pass similar legislation. These laws are not intended to render same-sex acts illegal. They already are, but to persecute people on the basis of their sexual orientation. Such laws are not only unjust, but they also have the potential to tear the fabric of society if they are misused to facilitate false denunciations for gain. That's the manipulation I was talking about. Advancement of vengeance, much as what Christians are exposed to in Pakistan under the country's intolerable blasphemy law. There is deep-seated sense of homophobia running throughout Africa and beyond. Russia, for example, recently passed anti-gay laws. We heard about that before the Olympics. African leaders routinely engage in populist homophobic rhetoric, often putting forward the fiction that homosexuality is un-African. In some cases, such as Nigeria's, homophobic sentiments and laws are deployed for political profit by embattled leaders. Some of these laws, by the way, were stimulated by Christians from the United States traveling to these countries and telling the legislatures that if they're Christian, they have to criminalize homosexuality. We're not doing enough in the United States, but by darn, you should do it in your country. That's where some of it's coming from. Christians are throwing gasoline on the fire here. Even in South Africa, where homosexuality and same-sex marriages are legal, homophobic bigotry finds expression in violent attacks on homosexuals and in corrective rapes, both of men and women. And often these crimes are unreported or ignored by the police. The effects of homophobia are also seen in an inordinately high rate of suicides among homosexuals, especially teenagers. Homophobia is largely premised on a false notion that homosexuality is chosen and curable. Now, this next statement is a little ambiguous. It says, this month, the Spanish Cardinal-elect Fernando Sebastián Aguilar, a retired bishop of Pamplona, made the astonishing claim that homosexuality is a defect comparable to the condition of high blood pressure. Now, he probably was trying to say something like, it's inherited, it's not a choice, but that's not a very good way to explain it. In Africa, homophobic perceptions are encouraged, here it is, by fundamentalist Christian groups, especially from the United States, which are said to agitate anti-gay legislation, and by the proponents of the Islamic Sharia law. So the Muslims are also doing it in Africa, and then the fundamentalist Christians arrive from the United States, and they say the Christians should do it. Their position is in conflict with Catholic teaching. The Church cannot sponsor the criminalization of matters of private morality, and much less the advocacy of human rights. Prejudice and persecution of homosexuals are in defiance of Catholic doctrines. Even as it emphatically rejects homosexual carnal acts, the Catechism of the Catholic Church declares every sign of unjust discrimination in their homosexual regard should be avoided. The Catechism further demands that homosexuals must be accepted with respect, compassion, and sensitivity. Jailing homosexuals for being gay and insisting on their human rights, or even for having sex, self-evidently is a sign of unjust discrimination that lacks in respect and compassion. While the Church's teachings prevent her from standing with homosexuals on many issues, especially same-sex marriage, she has an obligation, mandated by Christ, to be in solidarity with those who are unjustly marginalized and persecuted. Alas, the Church has been silent, in some cases even quietly complicit in the discourse on new homophobic laws. The absence of intervention for justice may well be interpreted wrongly or rightly, not as approval of injustice, as in line with the maxim qui tacit consentire videtur, silence gives consent. Instead, the Church should be present herself as compassionate and courageous in standing with those who are living in fear. African Catholic bishops especially should speak out as loudly as they do on same-sex marriage against discriminatory legislation and violence directed at homosexuals, many of whom are fellow Catholics. Where is the prophetic voice of the Church in condemning this general homophobia in society? it would be a very peculiar reading of the gospel to locate Jesus anywhere else but at the side of the marginalized and vulnerable. The church must be seen to be standing with Jesus and those who faced unjust persecution, even if, especially if, it does not condone the lifestyle of those at risk. That would be true Christian witness. Given its source, I think this is a pretty courageous statement. It's also self-critical of its own community, that recognizes disagreement but does not promote bigotry on the basis of difference. Rather finds a common humanity with those who are different and stands up against discrimination against them, including discrimination tacitly accepted by one's own religious community. This is an example of real community building at work. Now, I chose that not because I want to give the Catholic Church a lot of credit, but everywhere you will find people who are trying to go beyond the limits of us versus them, and to find, even in their own tradition, which may be narrow on some issues, some values of sharing with others. I think that's the attitude that all communities have to have. You see, some people are afraid, well, gee, if we reach out to those people, I am giving up my personal beliefs. Not at all. Not at all. We have commonality with people. The fact that there are differences, as Steve told the children, that makes life interesting. But to forget that we have commonality with human beings who are persecuted is a very serious sign that your sense of community is not very healthy. So I think we have thinking to do about this. And luckily, I think your community is well ahead of many others in thinking about this, which is wonderful. But don't stop. Keep going. Keep finding ways to incorporate others, to join with others, and to join with other communities of worship, to try to find some common ground, to focus on problems that are dividing us today. So that's all I have to say. We have a mic here for sharing.